Okay, so welcome everyone to the fourth of our Back to the Future seminars. This is the inaugural event or series of events for our international research network on the history of the 1980s. History being broadly defined, but obviously welcome all disciplines. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Martin Smith of the University of Sheffield, who's of course just down the road from me here at York St John. And Martin, as you will know, is a historian of modern and contemporary Japan. Martin's latest research takes an interdisciplinary approach to the study of sound and the history of technology in Japan and Asia. He's particularly interested in the ways in which sound was perceived, hierarchized, regulated, manipulated, and given meaning differently in different places and at different times. Martin is a founding member of the Asian Sound Culture Studies and Modernity Project, which is a large multi-year project, and together with colleagues based in Tokyo and the British Library, working on lots of very important and innovative research there. And some of this research has already been seen in Martin's most recent book, which is Mass Media Consumerism and National Identity in Post-War Japan, where he examined the transformation of nationalism and national identity in connection to the rise of the consumer society. So without further ado, Martin, opportunity knocks, over to you.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks everybody for turning up. I know I didn't get out a description of what I was doing early enough, really, but that was me traveling. I've been traveling in Japan for a while. As Jim said, my interest has usually been in nationalism and national identity. My first book looked at the rise of consumerism in post-war Japan, and how that related to notions of nation and nationalism, national identity. And what I'm going to talk about today is my latest project that's come out of work that I've been doing for a few years on the soundscape and the history of urban sound, as well as sound recording, particularly in Japan. Last year, I edited a book with some colleagues that looked at sound cultures across Asia, and I wrote there about the discourse and debates over urban noise, the definition of urban noise in Japan, and how they were transformed over the last 120, 130 years. But what I'm going to talk about, and I'll try and keep this to around half an hour so that there's time for some questions, and hopefully I won't end up rambling on too much about different things. But what I'm going to talk about today is my latest project, which is a 2-year research project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, that looks at the development of sound recording, field recording, the technology for sound recording, and how that was shaped and formed, and how that interacted with the rise of consumerism in Japan in the post-war period, and how that gradually became attached to notions of national identity and even nationalism in Japan. My project goes from 1952, which some of you probably know is the return to independence for Japan after 7 years of occupation by the US, from 1952 through to 1997. What happens over that period, and the reason is I've chosen sort of that period to begin and stop. As a historian, you've always got to find a place to begin and a place where you're going to finish, and a reason for that, I guess. Is basically the end of the occupation. So the US restores independence, I'll put that in inverted commas, to Japan in 1952. And from that period onwards, from around 1952, you start to get the rapid development of domestically produced sound recording equipment. By 1997, the Japanese government, the Ministry of the Environment, has established a 100 Soundscapes of Japan program that asks people to record scenes to record sounds from around the country that they feel are either under threat or that have some significance for them. And so they end up with around 600 to 700 sound recordings being sent in as part of this project, some by professional sound recorders, many by amateurs, and they produced this double CD of these 100 soundscapes of Japan, and with a website that explains what the different sounds are and what you can hear in different parts of Japan. And so my interest here is in how that connection is made between going and recording sounds of everyday life, or the urban environment, or even the natural environment, and how those sounds then become in the discourse connected to a notion of Japaneseness or Japanese national identity. But what I want to talk about today, because of course this is a seminar series about the 1980s, and most of my research up to now has been on the 60s and the 70s, and so I want to focus on a particular period in sound recording culture. I'll introduce a little bit of the history in a minute, but I also want to focus just on a certain period of sound recording when it became outdoor sound recording became a very popular hobby for young Japanese people, and there were magazines and books, how-to books, as well as meetings and societies that got together to discuss what to record, how to record it, how to understand sound. Some of the pictures that you can see on the screen at the moment are from a magazine which is called Roku Han, which is what it says at the top there, which translates as live sound hunting. The Han is hunt, so Roku is recording. And this magazine went from 1975 and ended in 1979, 1980. And the hobby of young people, lots of young people going out around the country and recording things or recording their everyday life, began to die out in the 1980s. So I guess my question in relation to this seminar, and for the experts here on the 1980s is why the 1980s, why this emerges, and then why it begins to die out by the mid-1980s. I'm going to try and put my ideas forward, but this is a question that obviously as part of this project I've kind of got to try and answer. What is it about the 1980s that changes the nature of the hobby of sound recording and the way that it is presented and talked about? I'm just going to try and change the slide, which I can't. Oh, there we are. The very first edition of this magazine begins with this article, quite a long article. You can see it here, called "The Seven Senses Expedition," and it follows these young sound hunters with all their equipment who get in a jeep in Tokyo and drive to Aokigahara Forest, which is at the base of Mount Fuji. And if anybody knows it, it's very famous because it's one of the most favored, most famous or infamous suicide spots in Japan, where people disappear because it's such a big, dense forest. People go there to commit suicide and generally don't get found for quite a long time. And so they go there because underneath this forest, there's these caves. And there's a dense network of caves underground. And so they're off to record the forest and to record the sounds in the cave. As they go down into the cave, the article discusses the noises that they can hear, the sudden disappearance of light. Of course, it's dark, it's cold, it's damp. They set up their equipment and they sit there in the dark and just listen and try to record the noises. But what they describe is that gradually it becomes really difficult, almost impossible, to distinguish the sounds of their own bodies. So the breathing, the pulse, the blood flowing, the noises in their ears, with the sounds that are being made by the cave itself. So there's icicles in the cave that they describe them as making screeching sounds that sound like they come from human beings, and it's very difficult to distinguish what's human sound and what is coming from the cave itself, or the animals in the cave, the bats and other animals moving around the cave as well. Eventually they record for a while and then they flee. They all get very scared and they flee back to the outside world, to the normal everyday rhythms and sounds of the outside world. But what's interesting about this article is that it kind of sets the tone for how the hobby of sound recording is portrayed for young people in the early 1970s, the mid 1970s, when it becomes popular. It's an adventurous hobby. It's a creative hobby. It's a hobby that is supposed to get you outside and thinking about the environment, but also being creative in the way that you think about the environment. And this article in the first edition of the magazine Rokuhan, 1975, epitomizes that idea of a big adventure with a lot of your friends, to kind of, in a sense, bucking the trend of other boring stay-at-home hobbies, not watching TV, not sitting around watching TV, and that kind of thing. So Namaroku, this hobby of live recording, which Namaroku translates really as live recording, is really a trend for outdoor live sound recording. As I said, it emerges in the early 1970s, but it comes out of a history through the 1960s, and it then disappears by the mid to late 1980s. There's the magazine Rokuhan. There's a lot of different guidebooks and manuals on how to make your own sound recordings, discussing what kind of equipment to use, what you should do. And what the hobby does is emphasizes creativity, originality, and individual freedom in the hunt or the recording of real, what the magazines describe as real sound. And there's a lot of discussion in these magazines and journals and books about what real sound is, what is the difference between a recorded sound and a real sound. And eventually what those discourses do, and I'll mention this a little bit in a few minutes, is leave it up to the recorder themselves, the person doing it, to create the sound, so that they should think about the sound. The sound is not, they should realize that when they place their tape recorder or their microphone, they are not capturing a natural sound, they are actually creating a sound. And that is, in the discourse, is something that they have to think about. They're urged to think about deeply when they go out and record these sounds. For me, what's interesting, given the work that I've done before on national identity and consumerism, is this way of listening that this hobby presents, treats sound as a commodity in this increasingly mediatized consumer society that's developed in Japan through the 1960s and the 1970s, and really comes to fruition in the 1980s, when Japan is almost, by 1985, the largest economy in the world. So you kind of have this double commodification of sound, the commodification of sound through the media that captures it, and the commodification of sound within a media culture that produces mass magazines and books that people are, and equipment that people are supposed to go out and buy to do this sound recording. As I mentioned, from the 50s, you start to get the production of domestic sound recording equipment. And one of the reasons, of course, that by the 1970s this hobby can take off is because sound recording equipment has become much smaller, much cheaper, and much more convenient by the 1970s than it is in the 1950s or even in the early 1960s. At the bottom picture here is called the G-type recorder that was made by Sony in the very early 50s, late 40s, early 50s, which was mainly used for recording interviews. Basically, the first recording equipment was brought over by the US occupation authorities from 1945-46 in order for them to interview people who experienced the atomic bombing in Hiroshima, so that they could, find out how magnificently destructive and horrifying the bomb itself was. And so the first sound recorders like this one were heavy. You couldn't really move them. This was it weighed 35 kilograms. So it wasn't supposed to be moved. It wasn't an outdoor sound recording thing. It was something that you set up and you left. But Sony gradually begins to develop these things, and in 1952, they bring out one that has been designed to be portable. You can see the one on the top left that looks more like a suitcase. Sony teamed up with luggage manufacturers to create a nice soft shell for the outside of this recorder, replaced parts of the metal body with wood to make it look very nice and stylish and trendy. And the idea is that this is kind of it's still something that you wouldn't lug around and record while you're walking, but it's something that you could take with you to places, particularly if you're going to a party or something like that. You'd be able to record what was going on while you were there. The other one on the right is made particularly for journalists, and it's the first recorder that's taken out into the streets in Japan, actually in the late 1940s, to record interviews with people on the street. And so you get immediate opinions about the news and news stories, and journalists start to walk around with lug this equipment around in the streets. By the mid-1950s, there's an increasing professional interest in outdoor sound recording. This album, produced by Toshiba, it comes out in 1958. Tokyo Has People in Its Sounds there's 2 volumes to this. I've listened to the first one. It's aimed really at a foreign audience, and on the back of the record, it explains to you what each soundscape is. And what this album does is it visits different parts of Tokyo and records the sounds, and then on the back of the album, as I say, it explains what each sound is. It gives you the context for each sound. Some of them are perhaps what we would think of today as normal or Japanese soundscapes. They go to Tokyo train station and record the sounds of the trains, and it's very similar to the many digital files you can find online recording the sounds of Japanese train stations. They also go to the big temple in Asakusa, one of the most famous big temples there, and listen to that. They visit Tsukiji, which is the very famous fish market in Tokyo, and listen to the sounds of the people selling the fish and the customers there. They also visit the Greek Orthodox Cathedral in Tokyo and listen to the bell of the Greek Orthodox Cathedral in Tokyo. And I'm not quite sure why that's chosen as symbolic, but it explains on the back of the record that it's a very important sound mark for Tokyo that marks out an area of Tokyo in particular. So by the mid-50s, there's a growing interest, as there is everywhere in the world, I would say, particularly in the Western America, in Western Europe and America, in stereo equipment in the home, and listening to records, particularly in the home. In Japan, slightly differently perhaps from Western Europe and America, but in the mid-50s, most of the listening to records is done in large cafes, which become famous and popular because of their sound system. There would be a cafe where you can go and listen to different kinds of music or different kinds of sounds, and these came out of the jazz cafes that emerged in the 1920s and the 1930s in Japan. So because equipment was a little bit too expensive for most Japanese people in the 1950s, much of the listening to albums and records was done in cafes all over Japan. There were these cafes. It was quite a popular culture. But as I say, by the 1960s, rapid economic growth takes off in Japan from the late 50s through the 60s, and incomes begin to double, even triple throughout the 1960s. But the equipment begins to get smaller. The invention of the transistor, of course, and then its adoption by Sony and its transformation by Sony changed the nature of the recording equipment. And also Philips, of course, inventing the cassette recorder and then sharing the plans on how to make that for free rather than keeping it to make money out of, meant that companies like Sony could then begin, and Toshiba and other Japanese companies then began to start to make smaller and smaller equipment for sound recording. And by the by the late 1960s, there's a lot of different equipment for sound recording that is cheap, and in the homes, more and more Japanese people have got equipment for listening to music or listening to recordings. But you gradually, by the late 60s, get this this promotion of the dual nature of some of the equipment, so that you can listen back to sounds. You can play sounds on these tape recorders in your home. It's got a speaker, it's got different control levels. But at the same time, the same thing can be taken out, because the microphones are now becoming embedded in the machines, or they are, you can attach a microphone with a cable in order to capture sounds. And as you can see from this Sony advert here, this has a shoulder strap that means you can carry it around with you and take it out wherever you go. So the emphasis becomes on taking hi-fi outside and then capturing sounds yourself, as you can see from some of the pictures in the top right of this, going around and capturing your own sounds and then going back home and listening to them when you get back home. Obviously, these things come with all the equipment you can buy. You can buy all these different microphones, different kinds of batteries that last a bit longer. Depends how much money you've got. You can spend whatever money you want on these things, of course. In the hobby, in terms of the hobby itself, in the discourse around what you should be doing when you go out and start to record sounds with this equipment, the fun is supposed to be in copying the sounds, recording them onto a tape, and then reproducing them and playing them back. So you've got to remember, as I said before, that you're not capturing natural sound. You've got to think about what the sound is that you're listening to, what the best way to capture that sound might be, so that when you play it back, it's as close to the real sound as it's possible to be. But what's interesting for me is that the emphasis is also on individuality and creativity. So one of the books that's produced in the mid-70s explains to people who are interested in the hobby of sound recording that they need to think about what type of sound recorder they are, what type of person and personality do they have, and how would that reflect in their sound recording. So you can choose from many different things that you could record or do. So there are some people who just want to record events and festivals, some people who like the noise of the new urban lifestyles, the machines, the cars, traffic sounds, train sounds, aeroplane sounds, motor racing sounds. Then there are people who want to just capture folk music, traditional arts, things that are dying out that need to be preserved. And there's also those people who live in the sound of nature, the ones who just want to be out capturing the organic sounds of the world. What you've got to do, it's stressed in these manuals, is choose what kind of type you are and work on it and become very, very good at recording that kind of sound. The more you study the sound of those kind of events or noises, the traffic noise or the machine noise, the more you'll understand what it means to capture that sound and recreate that sound when you play it back. It's some pictures from the magazine. It's, as I say, the whole point here is in being individual, getting out and being creative, but also in being adventurous. And so you can see the guy here with pointing his large microphone receiver at no doubt at some unsuspecting animals, probably some birds. And then there's the guys here with the steam trains. This is the period, the early 70s, when the last steam train makes its journey around Hokkaido in Japan. And this is a big event for sound hunters and sound recordists trying to capture this. There's an element of danger involved. It's perhaps my favorite picture from these, in that in order to capture the different sounds of the train, you need to be in certain positions in relation to the train. So if you want to capture the sound of the train coming towards you, you need two microphones, one on each side of the rail track, and you need to let the train go over them. It will sound then like the train is coming over you. If you want to capture the train going away, you stand at the side with two microphones spaced very far apart, and it will sound like the train is going past you, in front of you instead of over you. And so these discussions are all taking place in the magazine. There's a lot of overlap here in this period with photography, which is obviously developing in Japan with Fujifilm and Kodak, not Kodak, Fujifilm and all the other camera manufacturers, Minolta and other camera manufacturers in Japan, making cheaper and cheaper cameras. That needs exploring more deeply. It's not something I'm looking into in the next couple of years, but I think it's a fascinating parallel. So you can see a lot of the guys have cameras and sound recording equipment when they go to these events. Obviously, as I said, there's a big consumer element to this. And so if you want to go out and capture sounds and record the right sound, you've got to have the right gear. And so this tells you here what you need to be wearing if you want to be a sound recordist, how you should look. You need the boots for walking around. You need the microphones need to be the right kind of microphones for what you want to record. There's a bicycle. You can attach microphones to the handlebars of your bicycle, keep your recorder in the basket, and then cycle around. And with that, then, of course, comes all the other equipment that really takes off in the mid-70s. And this magazine explains all the sort of things that you should buy if you want to be the ultimate sound recordist. But the emphasis here is all on getting out, being individual, adventurous and creative. There are different kinds of fashions. So on the left there it says heavy. So in that sense it's a serious sound recording. Somebody who's serious about sound recording with a large sound recorder. Obviously you're going to need all the camping equipment because you're going to be out for much longer. You're going to need a bigger rucksack because you're going to be carrying heavier equipment. And on the right side of the screen, the light, it says light fashion, which is very different, as you can see. It's interesting they use women here, and there needs to be a lot more research done on the hobby in the 70s, but there is a lot in the magazines. It is quite mixed. There are quite a lot of young women participating in the research, in the activities and the hobbies and the groups doing the sound recording. At the same time, these pictures probably are being used to sell the stuff, as is usually the case in consumer society in the 60s and the 70s. That's aimed at young men. I don't know, maybe most of you perhaps don't know any Japanese, but it says find out your 6.5 fashion at the top here. And it took me a while to realize that the reason it says 6.5 is because in Japanese 6 is roku and half is han. So roku han, and so I didn't even pay attention to it for ages, and it's just suddenly dawned on me one day that it's just roku han. It doesn't seem to be any other reason for that number being there except that it's pronounced the same as the name of the magazine. There you go. The other thing they did, and what's more interesting from my perspective in looking at national identity and nationalism, is that these books and journals and magazines began to present Japan as a place with certain specific sounds. And this map here is of Hokkaido, the North Island, and Honshu, the main island. Not all of it, but mainly the north, and Tokyo across to Kyoto. And we don't get the rest of it, Hiroshima, and that's not on there. But you can see here, what this is different places around the country you should go to hear different sounds. And in many cases, it tells you when the best time of year is to go there. Some of them are festivals. Some of them, such as around Fuji, are for listening to the speedway. Around Mount Fuji, there was a large speedway track, so car racing. In the north, Hokkaido, the steam trains, but also it says jets right up in the top there, and that's about Hokkaido Airport. You can go and listen to the sounds of the airplanes. And so the other thing that's going on here with this hobby is that sound is gradually becoming connected to place, and it's becoming connected to place in such a way that it's framed within a space that is the nation. And in terms of what I've done in my other research, this is interesting for me because it seems to me that it's the late 60s and the 70s that you start to get the emergence of a strong sense of a re-emergence perhaps of a strong sense of a national identity, but one that's nothing like it was, say, in the 1920s, 30s or mid 40s, because it's clearly embedded in a consumer society. And so for me, that's the really interesting element here. You can see again some of the focus on adventure and getting out and about from some of the covers from the magazine here. It moves though, and so the previous ones are from the early mid 70s when the magazine first comes out, and then these are from 79, 80 when the magazine starts to change completely. And the focus here then becomes on being inside more, and the focus moves to a more electronic approach to sound in the terms of you stay at home in your bedroom and you manipulate the sounds. You take tracks from other places and add other things to them, and that starts to change the way the hobby of sound recording is seen. That accompanies in many ways the rise of electronic music, which by the mid 70s, Japan is globally famous for Yellow Magic Orchestra and other Sakamoto Ryuichi and people like that who are experimenting with electronic music. So there's a gradual shift in the focus here that means that the hobby begins to die out. This magazine ends its publication in 1980 and changes to Sound Creator. It becomes known as Sound Creator throughout the 1980s with a very different focus. So my question, and I guess getting back to the 1980s, is why in the 1980s is there suddenly this transformation or change in the nature of sound hunting and sound recording or field recording, outdoor field recording? I want to, and I don't know, and maybe some of you will have some idea, of where this could be going. But in the 1980s, the soundscape studies movement takes off in Japan. The Institute for Kanda Soundscape Studies is founded in the mid 80s by Keiko Torigoe. She studied with Murray Schafer in Canada, who is famous for setting up the World Soundscapes Project at Simon Fraser University in the late 60s and early 70s. And he died only a year or two ago, and of course is one of the pillars of this idea of the soundscape and how we should record soundscapes and how we should think about them. And so the Institute for Kanda Soundscape Studies, which Kanda is a part of Tokyo, specific part of Tokyo, was modeled on that project. Keiko Torigoe was a student of Murray Schafer. She translated his book, Soundscapes and the Tuning of the World, in the 1980s. She translated it into Japanese. And what she did in her project in Kanda was survey people, older people living in Kanda, about their memories of the soundscapes and when it changed and what they remembered about that change and how it changed and when. What came out of that survey was that the first big change these people remembered was in 1925 after the Tokyo earthquake, when large areas of Kanda were rebuilt into pretty much as they are today, into a new modern city. But also 1964, which was the year when Japan hosted the Olympic Games, and the rebuilding of Japan after the post-war, after the defeat in 1945, came to sort of almost to a conclusion in 1964 with new roads, new highways, new traffic. The sound of traffic increased by 1964 and these kind of things. So that begins in the 1980s, this idea of thinking about the soundscape in an almost academic kind of way, in the study of soundscape itself, rather than the interest in the soundscape that these people had in the 60s and the 70s, which was more based on individual creativity and individualism. In 1993, the Soundscape Association of Japan is formed. There's a website still, it goes on today, it organizes conferences and workshops several times a year. And as I said at the start, in 1997, the Ministry of the Environment released the 100 Soundscapes of Japan CD. And from that point on, it seems to me there's a proliferation of sound recordings about Japan available, particularly once we get into the digital age in the late 2000s. Everywhere you go online, particularly on YouTube, you can find soundscapes of Japan. But what's interesting for me is that at some point, and I think by the 1980s, the mid 1980s, that connection between sound and national identity is solidified, so that we can now have a Japanese soundscape. And what I'm interested in is, you know, where that came from. How did that arrive? How did people start to think about sound within a national, a framework of national identity? Some conclusions, and they're only, yeah, I've still got another 2 years left on this project, so these are early conclusions here. But sound recording and field recording, as it emerged in the late 60s and 70s, when it started to become popular, was connected to the countercultures, to the student protest movements particularly, and the kind of a rise of individualism and creativity and self-awareness, shall we say, that emerged in the 60s all over the world, globally, with the student movement particularly. It was the same with photography. Photography changed in Japan in the 60s thanks to this counterculture that emerged. But it also meant that it got tied in with a media discourse that promoted this, that was part of this discourse in the 60s and the 70s. So sound recording was about the individual. It was amateur. It was against professionalization. That wasn't what they wanted. It was about being amateur. Namu, the use of the Chinese character Namu and Roku here as sound recording. Nama is kind of, it means live. It's used to refer to raw food, raw fish, raw meat. So the idea was that this wasn't perfect. This is raw. It's and now we translate it generally as live, but that's the idea there. So for me, the question is, well, what happens in the 80s that allows this to sort of solidify? There are Carol Gisterveld, who's written about Europe, the tape recorder in Europe, and the hobby of sound recording in Europe in the 60s particularly, and also quite a few other people in sound studies see this question as one of remediation, that new technology arrives and people just don't do that anymore. So you start to get the rise, as I said, of the mixing desks and that kind of thing, and computers where people can work on sounds on their own in the house. They don't need to go out and do things like that. That's one response. I don't know about that one. Co-optation is also, you know, always the response to what happens to the student movement. Well, it just gets sort of brought into a wider media discourse and sort of toned down by the capitalist imperative to go and buy stuff. Or bureaucratization, which I kind of thought of earlier today as perhaps one way of thinking about what happens with the soundscape movement. In many ways, the discourse nowadays in Japan about the Japanese soundscape is that it emerges with Keiko Torigoe in the 1980s and comes directly from the World Soundscape Project in Canada. And so in many ways, it's only through the understandings of Pierre Schaeffer's work and other people like Barry Truon and these guys, that we can understand the connection of soundscape, or the origin of the soundscape idea in Japan. And what that does then in the focus on that is take away this period perhaps when everybody was being an individual, was going out and creating and recording their own sounds, finding their own way of thinking about the soundscape. But those are all just, you know, small conclusions. I haven't come to any conclusions. I'm putting them out there as questions, really. And I'm going to stop because I realize I've been talking for about 40 minutes. So yeah, I don't know if James is still there. Is James there still? Oh no, he's not. No, James. Okay, I'm afraid he's still with me. James, his wife is having a baby, and there was a possibility he might have to disappear during the talk, and I am hoping that's the reason he's gone, and it wasn't because I was a bit too boring. But we've got a little bit of time for questions. I'd like to hear, I know there's not many of us, but it would just be nice to hear people's thoughts or ideas or anything. there is a chat function, as you know, where you can type questions, a Q&A section that you can type questions into. I don't know if I can share your microphones, but certainly if you put questions in the Q&A, hopefully I'll be able to answer them. We can maybe have a discussion. Alternatively, if you'd like to talk, I think I can allow you to talk if you've got a microphone that works. It would be quite nice to hear people's voice other than my own. Yeah, Silvio, yeah, shall I turn you on? Yeah, hang on. Let me hang on, Silvio. Let me try, and if I click allow to talk, can you click on your microphone and unmute your microphone?
Okay, Martin.
Yeah, great. I can hear you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I will not open my camera right now, but it's very easy, very fast. My question is, Martin, I really think in the recent years, in technological terms, everything is going bigger and better and faster in terms of image. Because, for example, I think in Japan, we have already live transmissions in television made with 4K. 4K, yes?
Yeah.
And we see discussions about 8Ks and many new formats and new formats of displays, plasma, or OLED, etc. I think we have a technological gap inside the sound area, and I think this is we have much space to enhance this technology and the reception of the sound nowadays and for the days to come. Do you think, following this thinking, do you think with the emergence of new technologies like Dolby Atmos or neural captations of audio or 3D audio, do you think in Japan you will have maybe reborning of this counterculture in capturing atmospheric sounds, maybe? Do you think if the new technologies in terms of captation of audio would permit or would allow the return of this spirit of capturing the nation sounds? Did I have been clear? It was clear.
I think what's interesting for me is that a lot of that technology is really advancing. Like you said, the sound quality, the Dolby Atmos, the surround sound, it's developing rapidly. But at the same time, you're having a backlash from that, in that, you know, people are interested now, more and more interested again in buying vinyl records instead of listening to master quality albums digitally. People are more interested in buying CDs again than listening to the master quality audio. But also when I'm in Japan and I'm meeting people who are interested in doing some sound recording, the students, particularly at universities, they are happy enough to do it on their mobile phones, and a lot of them aren't going out and buying very expensive sound recording equipment. What they're doing is they're just taking their phones out and recording the sounds that they hear around them and then putting them onto the computer and messing around with them or uploading them or doing something creative with them. So I think in many ways there's still that idea there a little bit, that it's about creativity rather than just about, you know, capturing the true essence of sound, which is what the engineers want us to think. The engineers that sell this equipment and these new mediums for listening or recording, obviously the idea is that that's it's miles better and it's more important to listen that way. But actually, I think a lot of people are going the other way, if that sort of answers the question. Thanks. Gizem's put a question in. Was part of the desire about recording soundscapes about accessing, overpowering the natural through technology? I'm really interested in that question. I think it can be a little bit easy to think that that's what's going on. That's our gut reaction, is that it's human nature to want to control things, and I'm not sure how much of that is going on, because much of the discourse in the magazines and articles in the 70s and the early 80s is around the impossibility of capturing natural sound, because of recorded sound is not sound. Recorded sound is not natural sound. Recorded sound is recorded sound, and you can't capture or replay that moment. So what you've got is a recording, and what you concentrate on when you're doing the recording is what you want from that recording. So I think there's an awareness that you can't overpower the natural through sound technology in particular. But it's a really good question. And something that I really need to look deeper into when I look more at the debates and the discussions that are going on. Thank you. Excuse me. Gizem, it's more like creative nature capture, perhaps a way of grabbing hold of nature for yourself. But does that mean that it should? I'm a bit wary of thinking about it in terms of a kind of overpowering, because I think that's quite an easy way to think about how the relationship between technology and human culture or human society is really that just technology is just used to control things. Creative nature capture, I like that. Has anybody got any more questions? Really, thanks for listening. I'm really glad that people came to listen, to be honest. And I'm looking forward to maybe presenting on the same thing in a year or two when this project's a lot more developed. Hopefully it's finished in 2 years, or else I'll be in a little bit of trouble. But yeah, I'll be off to do field work and research in the summer and next summer as well. Thanks for coming. We've got another presentation next week that I think there'll be a link getting sent around about that. Hopefully Jim's doing all right with the baby, if that's where he's gone, which I think it must be. So good luck to Jim with that. But thanks everyone, thanks for listening. And thanks for the interesting questions, and I'm looking forward to discussing everybody's work as well in the next months. I'll close it there if that's all right. Thanks everyone.